He was only a month old, a golden retriever puppy, golden fur dulled by cold, small enough to fit in a shoebox. And yet, someone with more riches than they could ever spend decided he was disposable. They abandoned him in the blizzard alongside his exhausted mother and 6 tiny siblings. No shelter, no warmth. Just 7 trembling lives, huddled together beneath a sky of ice, waiting for a kindness they'd never known. The wind howled, the night deepened. No one came, until a woman, alone, grieving but fierce, heard their faint cries through the storm. What you're about to witness is a tale of survival and grace, of how a single act of compassion can rewrite the ending. Tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe love can rise even from the coldest nights, hit that subscribe button, because this story begins in the snow, but it doesn't stay there. The wind tore through Anchorage like a wild, howling beast, rattling window panes and hurling icy snow across the deserted streets. Under the suffocating weight of the storm, even the familiar city lights seemed to flicker and falter, their glow muted by swirling sheets of white. Snow had already piled knee-deep along the sidewalks, smothering every sound, every shape, every sign of life. Only the occasional flicker of a street lamp pierced through the gale, casting shadows that danced briefly before being swallowed by the blizzard's relentless surge. Through this punishing storm staggered Luna. She was a golden retriever, or at least she had been once, a proud, shining dog with a coat the color of warm sunlight. But now, she was gaunt, ribs protruding sharply under matted, ice-clumped fur, her eyes sunken and glassy with exhaustion. She dragged herself forward on trembling legs, each step leaving a small, shallow impression in the snow, before being instantly filled again by the relentless storm. In her mouth, she carried Max, the smallest of her 7 puppies, barely a month old, his cream-colored fur sticking out in frozen spikes where her warm saliva had frozen. Luna's nose was raw from cold, her breath coming in ragged gasps, vapor curling from her nostrils like desperate prayers. She knew the others were behind her, hidden somewhere beneath the thick snowdrifts. She had left them, just for a moment, bundled together under a half-fallen shrub near the edge of a long-forgotten road. Max had been the weakest. She had to carry him to shelter first. That was the plan. Then she would go back for the rest. But her legs were so weak. She stumbled, nearly dropping Max, then clenched her jaw tighter around his tiny body. His little chest fluttered faintly, almost too weak to notice. A sharp, painful jolt of fear lanced through Luna, stronger than the cold, stronger than the exhaustion. She had to keep going. Farther up the road, tucked between 2 darkened shops, was a small, narrow cafe with a wooden sign that had long since been sanded smooth by the Alaskan winds. Its windows glowed faintly from inside, the light blurred by the frost on the glass. Inside, Olivia Jenkins stirred uneasily in her chair. Olivia was a woman of 55, tall but slightly stooped from years of leaning over cafe counters, her body thin and wiry like a stretched wire. Her once dark hair had lightened over time to a soft ash gray, usually pulled back in a loose knot. Her skin, pale from the Alaskan winters, was marked at the corners of her eyes and mouth by fine, delicate lines, etched less by time and more by quiet solitude. She was a woman who had learned, with a kind of resigned grace, to be alone. Her husband had left her years ago, trading Alaska's cold for a warmer life far away, and the children they never had left a silence in her life she had filled with books, coffee beans, and the occasional conversation with regulars. She ran her cafe alone, with the occasional company of her grumpy old cat, Whiskers. Whiskers was currently curled into a tight ball on a blanket near the radiator, his orange tabby fur fluffed and his eyes narrowed in distaste every time the wind rattled the windows. At 15, Whiskers was as stubborn as his owner, his ears permanently nicked from old fights with neighborhood strays, his tail twitching with every unexpected sound. Olivia rose slowly, wrapping her thick wool cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The faintest sound had reached her ears. Not the wind, not the creak of the building, but something else. She turned her head toward the window, frowning, and a brow furrowed under softly arched eyebrows. Was it crying? She shuffled to the window, her slippers silent on the wood floor, and pressed her hand to the frosted pane. Outside, the world was a swirling chaos of white, no shapes, no figures. Just cold, Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe she was hearing her own heart, restless from too many hours alone. But there it was again, a faint, pitiful sound that cut through the storm, a high, broken whimper. "Whiskers, did you hear that?" Olivia murmured, glancing at the cat. Whiskers cracked open one eye, flicked his tail once, and then resolutely buried his face deeper into the blanket. Outside, Luna collapsed onto her side in the snow, Max rolling lightly from her mouth onto the frozen ground. Her flanks heaved. She tried to rise but found her legs trembling too hard, barely responding to her mind's desperate commands. Her eyes fluttered shut, just for a second, just to rest, until a faint movement stirred ahead. The cafe door creaked open a crack, a slice of golden light spilling onto the snow. Olivia, bundled in her cardigan and a hastily pulled-on winter coat, peered into the storm. The wind snatched at her scarf, tugging strands of her hair loose, biting her cheeks with an icy sting. She held a flashlight in her gloved hand, the beam wavering as she stepped cautiously onto the icy step. At first, all she saw was a shape, small, crumpled, nearly swallowed by snow. As she moved closer, the shape became two, one small and unmoving, the other a larger, shaking form. Her heart seized. "Oh, heavens!" she breathed, her voice instantly swept away by the wind. Luna lifted her head weakly, one last surge of instinct pulling her eyes upward. She locked eyes with Olivia, a human figure glowing faintly through the storm's haze. In that moment, everything Luna had endured, the betrayal, the abandonment, the cold, poured into one silent, pleading gaze. Olivia dropped to her knees, fumbling in the snow, scooping up Max first. He was so light, so cold, so heartbreakingly still. "Oh, little one, stay with me," she whispered, cradling him close to her chest. Then she turned to Luna. She had never been much of a dog person. She had always been more of a cat lady, more comfortable with aloof creatures who asked little of her. But something about Luna's eyes, the trembling of her thin frame, the desperate push of her nose toward the snow-covered path where her other puppies waited. It broke something open inside Olivia that she hadn't felt in years. "All right, girl," she murmured, slipping her arms under Luna's heavy, ice-laden body. "We're going to get you inside. Just hold on." Inside, Whiskers raised his head, huffing irritably as the door banged open, and a rush of frigid air swept through the room. Olivia staggered inside, Max bundled in her coat, and Luna cradled awkwardly in her arms, her muscles protesting under the surprising weight. She laid them gently on the old cushioned bench by the window, fumbling to pull blankets from the back room, muttering softly to herself, to the dogs, to the storm. As the blizzard howled beyond the walls, Olivia knelt beside the little family, her breath trembling. Outside, the 6 other puppies still waited, lost somewhere in the white. And as Luna, weak but determined, pushed her nose weakly toward the door once again, Olivia understood. This was only the beginning. The wind screamed louder that night, battering the wooden walls of Olivia's small cafe, rattling the windows until they trembled in their frames. Snow blew in thick, relentless sheets, smothering everything beneath a shroud of white. Olivia stood by the door, one hand gripping the flashlight so tightly her knuckles ached. She cast a nervous glance back inside, where Luna lay collapsed on the bench, her chest heaving in shallow, desperate breaths, and little Max bundled in a blanket at her side, trembling but alive. Olivia knew the other puppies were still out there. She could feel it like a weight in her chest, a gnawing certainty that pulled at her every breath. She was not a rescuer by nature, not a woman who leapt into storms or fought against the world's cruelty. She was a quiet woman, a cautious woman, shaped by years of loneliness, by the erosion of dreams that had left her world small and manageable. But tonight, something old and forgotten had stirred inside her, and it refused to let her rest. She tugged on her thickest winter coat, a heavy dark green parka lined with fleece, pulled an old knitted hat down over her gray-streaked hair, and wrapped a scarf twice around her thin neck. Her boots were cracked at the seams, worn from years of Alaskan winters, but they would have to do. Behind her, Whiskers let out a low, grumbling growl. The orange tabby, old and cantankerous, sat perched on the armrest of Olivia's reading chair, his fur puffed up and his yellow eyes narrowed with displeasure. At 15, Whiskers was a creature of habit, with a long scar across one ear from a fight long ago, and a tail that twitched irritably whenever his routine was disturbed. Tonight, His home had been invaded by not just one, but two muddy, frost-bitten intruders, and his displeasure was written in every tense muscle of his body. Olivia shot him an apologetic glance. "I know, old boy," she murmured, her voice muffled by the scarf, "but you'll have to deal with it a little longer." She turned back to the door, steeling herself. The flashlight beam wavered as she stepped out, the storm swallowing her instantly. Snow lashed her cheeks, sneaking under her scarf, burning her skin with icy needles. She pushed forward, boots crunching through the drifts, eyes narrowed against the stinging wind. Somewhere out there, 6 tiny lives were waiting. The faintest sound guided her, a thin, pitiful whimper, barely audible above the shrieking wind. She followed it, heart pounding, flashlight cutting weakly through the swirling snow. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, each step a battle against the cold that threatened to freeze her solid. And then, just beyond the edge of the light, she saw them. 6 small shapes, huddled beneath a half-fallen evergreen, their golden fur dusted white, tiny bodies shivering violently. They were pressed together in a trembling pile, eyes wide and glazed, their cries faint and broken. Olivia's throat tightened painfully. She knelt down, reaching out gloved hands to gather them in. Each puppy was barely more than a handful, their ribs sharp under thin skin, their tiny paws red with cold. They whimpered softly as she lifted them, curling instinctively into the warmth of her arms. She cradled 2 against her chest, tucking them inside her coat, then hurried back to the cafe, her legs shaking from the effort. Inside, Whiskers sprang to his feet, his back arched, hissing in outrage as Olivia stumbled through the door with the first bundle. Luna's head lifted weakly, eyes flicking toward her babies with a glimmer of desperate hope. Olivia quickly laid them beside Luna, wrapping them in spare towels and blankets before rushing back into the storm. The second trip was harder. Her fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, and the wind tore at her, pulling her off balance. She stumbled twice, once falling to her knees, snow soaking through the fabric of her pants. She cursed under her breath, gritting her teeth, forcing herself to rise. She found the next 2 puppies where she'd left them, still huddled together under the branches. They whimpered as she scooped them up, their tiny bodies cold as ice, their eyes fluttering open just enough to meet hers with a flicker of trust. She held them close, whispering softly to them as she made her way back, each step slower, heavier, the storm pressing down like a physical weight. Whiskers met her at the door again, this time with a yowl of indignation that cut through the howling wind. He darted back as Olivia staggered inside, brushing snow from her sleeves, setting the second pair of puppies down beside their siblings. Luna weakly licked their faces, her tail thumping faintly against the blanket. Olivia didn't pause. She turned and plunged back into the night. The last 2 puppies were nearly buried, only the faintest movement giving away their position under the snow. Olivia dropped to her knees, digging them out with trembling hands, her breath coming in harsh, panicked sobs. She pulled them free, cradling them close, and turned for home. By the time she reached the cafe, her strength was nearly gone. She leaned heavily against the doorframe, gasping, before forcing herself inside. Whiskers leapt onto the counter, glaring down with narrowed eyes, his tail flicking in furious disapproval. Olivia ignored him, collapsing onto her knees beside Luna, carefully laying the final 2 puppies down into the nest of blankets. Luna let out a low, exhausted whimper, her nose brushing over each of her babies in turn. Olivia watched as the puppies instinctively pressed close to their mother, their tiny bodies trembling, but alive. She let out a shaky breath, brushing damp hair from her forehead, her heart pounding in her chest. Whiskers, sensing the shift, jumped down cautiously, creeping closer. He sniffed the air, ears twitching, then let out a soft, almost offended huff before padding back to his chair and curling up with his back pointedly turned toward the new arrivals. Olivia laughed softly, a tired, choked sound, and reached out to scratch behind his ears as she passed. "You'll survive, Grumpy," she murmured. She settled into a chair near the dogs, wrapping herself in an old blanket, watching the little family huddle together, Luna's head resting protectively across her puppies. Outside, the storm raged on, battering the windows, but inside the cafe there was warmth and light and the fragile beginnings of hope. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in snow, every rooftop, every branch, every street lamp wrapped in a silent layer of white. Inside the small cafe, the air was thick with warmth. the smell of old wood and faint coffee lingering under the sharp scent of wet fur. Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor, a large towel spread out in front of her. One by one, she gently wiped each puppy dry, her thin, capable hands moving carefully, her fingers brushing over tiny ears and delicate paws. Luna lay nearby, her sides rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. She had drifted into an exhausted sleep, her head resting lightly on two of her puppies, her golden fur matted and stained. But her body relaxed at last. Olivia had always been a cat person. Years of quiet companionship with Whiskers had taught her to appreciate independence, aloofness, the kind of love that didn't demand constant attention. But as she worked her fingers carefully through Luna's tangled fur, Olivia felt something inside her soften. She paused as her hand brushed something cool and hard near Luna's neck. Peeling back the wet, clumped fur, she revealed a silver collar, dulled slightly with wear, but still elegant, its delicate engravings gleaming faintly under the light. Olivia leaned closer, squinting. There, etched in graceful script, were the words, "Luna, love from Rebecca." A frown creased Olivia's brow. Rebecca. The name stirred something faint in her memory, like the distant echo of a story half heard. She sat back on her heels, brushing damp strands of gray hair from her forehead, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. Who would abandon such a dog? A dog with a name, a past, a person who had once loved her enough to give her a silver collar. Whiskers leapt down from the windowsill, landing lightly beside Olivia with a faint thud. His orange fur was fluffed up, his yellow eyes sharp as they flicked toward the wet puppies squirming on the towels. With a disdainful huff, he circled once, then perched himself carefully on a nearby chair, watching everything with the narrowed gaze of a cat resigned to temporary chaos. Olivia let out a slow breath, her fingers absently stroking one of the sleeping puppies. She needed answers. Across town, Matthew Hartley sat alone in a grand study, his tall, lean figure slouched in a leather armchair near the fireplace. At 40, Matthew wore his wealth with quiet confidence, a tailored navy sweater that hugged his broad shoulders, dark jeans, and expensive leather boots, their shine dulled slightly by the snow tracked inside. His dark hair was cut short, streaked faintly at the temples with premature gray, his angular jaw dusted with a 2-day shadow of stubble. His sharp cheekbones and storm-gray eyes gave him a striking, if somewhat cold appearance, a man whose charm was often hidden behind walls he had built long ago. Tonight, those walls were cracked. He cradled a glass of whiskey between his long fingers, staring into the flickering fire with a hollow expression. The room around him was immaculate, bookshelves lined with first editions, gleaming oak floors, art hung with perfect symmetry, but there was no warmth in it. Not anymore. On the mantel above the fireplace stood a framed photo. Rebecca. Rebecca had been the warmth, the laughter, the one who had brought life into these walls. She had been radiant, her smile capable of melting even Matthew's carefully guarded exterior. Her honey blonde hair, her bright green eyes, her infectious laugh. They had filled the house, filled him, with something he hadn't realized he needed until it was gone. When Rebecca passed away suddenly 2 years ago, Matthew had crumbled in ways he hadn't let anyone see. He had thrown himself into his businesses, built walls higher and colder, and pushed away everything that reminded him of her, including Luna. Especially Luna. The dog had been Rebecca's shadow, following her through gardens, lying at her feet during late-night reading sessions, curling beside her on stormy nights. After Rebecca's death, Matthew couldn't stand the sight of Luna, couldn't bear the living reminder of what he had lost. He had told himself it was too painful, too much. He had told himself the dog would be fine, that he had done enough. But some nights, when the fire flickered low and the house sat too still, the memories crept in and guilt settled like a stone in his chest. He took another slow sip of whiskey, his eyes lingering on Rebecca's smile, and wondered, not for the first time, where Luna had gone. Olivia paced across the cafe's small front room, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The old space heater under the counter hummed weakly, offering little more than a faint halo of warmth. The walls, old wood lined with shelves of coffee jars and mismatched mugs, creaked softly as the wind pushed against them. She glanced toward the corner where Luna and her 7 puppies lay curled in a pile of old towels and worn blankets. The puppies squirmed faintly, tiny bodies trembling despite the layers she'd piled around them. Luna, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, kept nosing at each one, her tail giving small, tired thumps whenever one let out a weak cry. It wasn't enough. Olivia could feel it in her bones, the cold creeping through the floor, through the windows, through the very walls. She clenched her jaw, glancing once more toward Whiskers. The old tabby was perched high on a shelf, orange fur puffed out like a defensive cloud, glaring down at the canine invasion with unmasked irritation. His yellow eyes followed Olivia's every move, his tail twitching sharply each time she passed beneath him. "I know, Whiskers," Olivia murmured under her breath, brushing a hand through her short, silver-streaked hair. "You don't have to tell me. They need more than this." Without another word, she yanked on her coat, stuffing her feet back into damp boots. She stepped out into the cold night, pulling the door closed tightly behind her, the crunch of her footsteps vanishing into the muffling snow. Next door, the house belonged to Margaret Collins, a woman in her late 60s with the build of a retired school teacher, tall, slightly stooped, with silver hair always pinned in a neat bun and a face marked by deep laugh lines. Margaret was known around the neighborhood for her sharp wit, her obsession with knitting, and her enormous collection of old quilts. Olivia rapped on the door, her gloved knuckles barely making a sound against the thick oak. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing Margaret in a heavy robe, glasses perched low on her nose, knitting needles still clutched in one hand. "Olivia?" Margaret's sharp blue eyes softened with surprise. "What on earth are you doing out here in this storm?" "I need some help," Olivia said, her breath curling white in the air. It's a long story, but I need extra blankets. Anything warm you can spare, please." Margaret didn't hesitate. She motioned Olivia inside, bustling toward the hall closet with surprising energy. "I've got quilts, dear, thick ones. Bring them back when you can." She returned with an armful, pressing them into Olivia's arms. "Whatever this is, I hope it's worth it." "It is," Olivia murmured, clutching the bundles. "Thank you, Margaret." Back at the cafe, Olivia quickly spread the quilts across the floor, layering them thick beneath the puppies, wrapping one carefully around Luna's shivering form. She dragged the old wicker basket from behind the counter, Whisker's original cat bed from years ago, and patted it with folded towels, gently placing the smallest puppies inside, their faint cries softening as they settled into the warmth. She knelt beside Luna, brushing a trembling hand across the dog's forehead. "Hang on, girl," she whispered. "We'll get you through the night." Her mind was already racing toward morning. The vet clinic, she'd call first thing. She knew Emma would answer. Emma White was Anchorage's youngest and most promising veterinarian, just 28, but sharp, determined, with a reputation for compassion that went beyond simple care. Olivia remembered Emma well. Petite, with a heart-shaped face framed by wavy auburn hair, freckles scattered lightly across her nose, and an energy that filled every room she entered. She had been the kind of child who brought home injured birds, the kind of teenager who volunteered at every animal shelter, and now, the kind of professional who went the extra mile for every creature that crossed her path. Olivia exhaled slowly, leaning her forehead against her knees. She would call Emma in the morning. She would. Across the city, in the silent depths of his grand home, Matthew Hartley stood before a bookshelf, a half-empty glass of whiskey dangling from his hand. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the polished wood floor, the firelight flickering behind him. He reached out slowly, brushing his fingers across the dusty edge of a photograph. Rebecca. Caught mid-laughter, her arms wrapped tightly around Luna, the dog's tongue lolling in happy contentment. Matthew's jaw tightened. His dark gray eyes, usually cool and guarded, softened with a flicker of something rawer. Regret, perhaps, or memory's sting. He remembered the days after Rebecca's funeral, the crushing weight of loss, the suffocating silence of the house, the way Luna had followed him room to room, her soft eyes searching for the woman who would never return. At first he had tolerated it, but as weeks dragged into months, her presence had become unbearable. She was a reminder, a shadow of Rebecca's joy. And when Luna had given birth, 7 small, wriggling, needful lives, Matthew had felt his heart harden. He had told himself it was too much, that he couldn't do it, that they weren't his responsibility. He had given the order. He had turned his back. And now, standing there in the half-light, glass trembling faintly in his hand, Matthew wondered if that decision had been the final fracture in a heart already broken. Outside, snow piled higher against the windows, muffling the world in cold silence. Inside the cafe, Olivia wrapped the last blanket around Luna, whispering soft reassurances. Whiskers perched atop his shelf, his tail wrapped neatly over his paws, watching everything with the wary air of a ruler surveying a suddenly altered kingdom. Tomorrow would bring decisions, questions, and perhaps answers. But tonight, there was only this: warmth slowly returning to a pile of fragile bodies, a woman who had thought her life had quieted into final stillness, and a dog who, despite everything, had never given up on love. The pale winter sun crept slowly over Anchorage, casting faint golden rays across the snow-draped streets. Olivia stood bundled at the cafe door, her parka zipped to the chin, hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the soft, lined basket that cradled Luna and her 7 puppies. Their tiny bodies were tucked beneath layers of towels, their breaths faintly visible in the cold air. Luna, though still weak, lifted her head occasionally to nuzzle the pups, her deep brown eyes clouded with exhaustion, but flickering with a mother's stubborn determination. Olivia's own hands shook, not just from the cold, but from nerves. She had always handled things alone, run her cafe alone, lived her life alone. Stepping into a clinic, asking for help, trusting someone with this fragile little family, it wasn't something she was used to. But this morning, she had called the clinic the moment they opened, and the young woman on the other end had answered with such urgency, such kindness, that Olivia felt the first flicker of hope in days. The bell above the clinic door jingled softly as Olivia pushed inside. The room was clean and bright, smelling faintly of antiseptic and lavender. Behind the reception counter stood Emma White. She was petite, barely over 5 feet, with a heart-shaped face framed by a cascade of auburn curls tied loosely at the nape of her neck. Her green eyes sparkled with alertness, and her lightly freckled skin gave her an air of youthful energy. She wore a simple gray sweater under her lab coat, sleeves slightly rolled to reveal delicate wrists, and her small hands moved quickly as she waved Olivia in. "Come, let me help you." Emma's voice was soft but urgent, carrying a warmth that put Olivia instantly at ease. She stepped forward, gently lifting Luna from the basket with surprising strength for her slender frame. She cradled the dog carefully, murmuring reassurances, while Olivia followed, carrying the bundled puppies. In the examination room, Emma moved like a dancer, quick, precise, her hands steady but tender. She checked Luna's vitals, running practiced fingers along the dog's frail limbs, her brow furrowed in concern. She set up warming pads, adjusted heat lamps, and prepared nutritional supplements without missing a beat. "These little ones are severely malnourished," Emma said softly, crouching beside the lined basket where the puppies now lay, squirming weakly. "But they're fighters. If we stabilize their temperatures and get some nutrition into them, we have a good chance." Olivia watched from a chair in the corner, her slender hands wringing the edge of her scarf. Relief flooded through her at Emma's calm competence, but it was mixed with guilt. Guilt that she hadn't known what to do herself. Guilt that she hadn't been enough. Emma turned, catching Olivia's worried expression, and offered a reassuring smile. "You did the right thing bringing them here. Most people wouldn't have even tried." The words hit Olivia deeper than she expected, a warm ache blooming in her chest. She let out a shaky breath, managing a small, grateful smile. Meanwhile, across town, Matthew Hartley sat behind the wheel of his sleek black SUV, parked along the edge of a snowbank. He looked out over the white landscape, hands resting tensely on the steering wheel. His sharply defined features, angular jaw, high cheekbones, slightly narrowed storm gray eyes, were tight with conflict. Last night's memories haunted him still. The photograph of Rebecca, Luna at her feet, the warmth of those days he had shut out. He had told himself for months that it was done, that letting go was necessary. But the guilt had crept back, slow and unrelenting, until this morning it had driven him into the car with a vague, gnawing urge to find out where Luna had ended up. A contact at the local animal clinic had quietly confirmed a woman had brought in a golden retriever matching Luna's description that morning. Without thinking it through, Matthew had driven straight there. Now, standing just outside the clinic door, Matthew drew a long, bracing breath. His tall frame cast a long shadow across the snow, his tailored coat dark against the brightness of the day. The years had shaped him into a man of careful control, his reputation built on precision and decisiveness. Yet now, the idea of walking through that door, of confronting the choices he had made, left him feeling oddly small. Inside, Emma glanced up as the door jingled again. Olivia turned too, eyes widening slightly as a tall, sharply dressed man stepped in, shaking snow from his dark coat. For a beat, silence filled the room, thick and awkward. Matthew's gaze swept quickly across the space, landing first on Luna, lying pale but breathing beneath a heat lamp, her head lifting faintly at the sound of his voice, and then on Olivia, whose thin frame and kind but cautious eyes watched him with open curiosity. I'm looking for a dog," Matthew said, his voice rougher than he intended. "A golden retriever named Luna." Emma rose slowly, her small figure dwarfed by the tall man in the doorway. She extended a calm, professional hand. "Emma White, I'm the vet here. And you are?" "Matthew Hartley," he said quietly, running a hand through his dark, slightly tousled hair. She used to be mine." Olivia's eyes narrowed slightly, an instinctive protectiveness rising in her chest. She stood, moving subtly between Matthew and the dogs, her shoulders tense despite her slim build. She had no idea who this man was, but something about the sadness in his posture, the tightness around his mouth, told her he wasn't here for confrontation. Emma glanced between them, reading the room quickly. "Why don't you both sit?" she offered gently. "I think we have some things to talk about." Matthew lowered himself carefully into a chair, his large hands resting awkwardly on his knees. He looked toward Luna, who gave a faint, questioning whine, her deep brown eyes watching him with tired recognition. A silence stretched between the three adults, heavy with unspoken words, until Emma broke it softly. "We're doing everything we can for her and the puppies, but she's been through a lot." Matthew let out a slow breath, his carefully composed mask cracking just slightly. "I know," he murmured, "and I need to understand how this happened." Inside the quiet, sunlit clinic, the air was thick with unspoken words. Matthew sat forward in his chair, long fingers laced tightly together, his angular jaw tense, his gray eyes flickering between Luna and Olivia. The dog lay weakly under the warmth of the heat lamps, her golden fur matted, but her eyes alert, ears twitching faintly whenever Matthew shifted. Olivia stood near the corner, arms crossed, her slim figure framed by the soft morning light filtering through the window. Her face, usually gentle and lined with kindness, now held a sharp, defensive edge. She watched Matthew with cautious eyes, her silver-streaked hair pulled loosely back, her mouth set in a thin line. Beside her, Emma moved carefully between the dogs, her small frame bustling with gentle energy as she adjusted Luna's IV, brushed a hand over the puppies, and glanced up now and then to keep the tension in the room from snapping. Emma's auburn curls were tied back, a few strands escaping to frame her lightly freckled face. She looked younger than her 28 years, but there was a quiet authority in the way she spoke, the way she touched each animal with equal parts tenderness and skill. She sensed the storm brewing between Olivia and Matthew, and her soft green eyes darted between them, waiting for someone to break the silence. Finally, Matthew spoke. His voice was low, almost raw. "I didn't know how else to handle it." He rubbed a hand over his face, the rough stubble along his jaw rasping under his palm. "After Rebecca died, I couldn't stand having Luna around. She was everywhere, on the stairs, by the window, lying on Rebecca's side of the bed. She was Rebecca's shadow." He swallowed hard, his voice tightening. "I didn't hate her. I hated the reminder. I hated the house that felt so full of her ghost. And when Luna gave birth, it just broke something in me. I thought getting rid of them would make it easier. I told the staff to take them away. Out of sight. Out of mind." Olivia's fists clenched at her sides, a hot flush creeping up her neck. "So you abandoned her?" she snapped, stepping forward, her thin frame trembling with anger. "You let them toss her out in the cold with 7 helpless puppies because you were grieving? Because it was hard for you?" Matthew flinched slightly, his shoulders tightening, but he didn't look away. "I know," he murmured, his voice rough. "I know it was wrong." Emma moved quickly, placing a small hand on Olivia's arm. "Olivia, wait," she said gently. "I think maybe this is his chance to fix it." Olivia's eyes were wet, but she shook her head sharply. "People like him don't fix things. They just feel guilty when they get caught." Matthew straightened slowly, his tall frame unfolding from the chair. There was no arrogance in his stance, only exhaustion, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from years of keeping grief bottled tight. "I'm not here to take her back because I think it'll erase what I did. I'm here because I owe her something. Anything." Emma glanced between them, her eyes softening. "Then start here," she said quietly. "Help us care for them. Help us make sure they survive. It's not too late to show up now." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Matthew exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly, and he stepped closer to Luna. He crouched carefully beside her, his expensive coat brushing the floor, his large hands moving hesitantly to rest on the edge of the blanket. Luna lifted her head faintly, her nose twitching as she sniffed at him, her tail giving a single tentative wag. Matthew's voice cracked. "Hey girl, I'm sorry." Meanwhile, back at the cafe, the atmosphere had shifted. Whiskers, the 15-year-old orange tabby with a battered ear and a temper to match, sat perched on the counter, his yellow eyes narrowed as he surveyed the new arrivals. Olivia's friend Margaret had stopped by earlier to check in, her tall, stooped figure wrapped in a thick knit shawl, her sharp blue eyes sparkling with amusement as she watched the scene unfold. Whiskers flicked his tail, his posture stiff, as one of the puppies, a plump little male with a cream-colored coat and a tiny pink nose, toddled clumsily across the floor, heading straight for him. The kitten-sized puppy gave a hopeful little yip, wagging his tiny tail, and Whisker's eyes widened in alarm. Margaret chuckled softly from her seat near the window. "Looks like your kingdom's been invaded, Whiskers." With a long, suffering sigh, Whiskers leapt down from the counter and padded to the far side of the room, settling himself atop the bookshelf, where the puppies couldn't reach. But his eyes stayed fixed on them, watchful, curious despite himself. Back at the clinic, Olivia watched as Matthew gently stroked Luna's head, his carefully guarded exterior cracking further with each soft touch. Emma moved quietly among them, adjusting the heat lamps, checking the puppy's vitals, offering a steadying presence that anchored the room. Olivia let out a slow breath, some of her anger ebbing. She still didn't trust Matthew, not fully, but seeing the way Luna responded to him, the soft whine, the weak tail wag, the faint nuzzle of her nose, made her wonder if, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption here. She crossed her arms, her voice quieter now. "If you want to help," she murmured, "you'll need to prove it with more than words." Matthew nodded, his jaw set, his gray eyes shadowed but determined. "I will." And for the first time that morning, a fragile sense of possibility filled the room, like the first crack of sunlight after a long, bitter night. The late afternoon sun hung low over Anchorage, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets. Inside the clinic, the once tense atmosphere had begun to thaw, replaced by the steady, purposeful hum of action. Matthew Hartley stood near the reception desk, his tall frame slightly stooped as he spoke in a low, firm voice over his phone. His dark coat was draped across one arm, revealing a tailored charcoal suit beneath, and his sharp features, angular jaw, high cheekbones, storm gray eyes, were set in determined lines. The man who had once retreated from pain was now facing it head-on. "I want the best team you have," Matthew said quietly into the phone, pacing slightly. "I don't care what it costs. Get them here by tonight. Luna and the puppies need full care, specialized treatment, everything. Understood?" Across the room, Olivia watched, arms folded, her slender frame tense but no longer cold with anger. She stood near the window, the pale light catching the streaks of silver in her neatly tied back hair, her pale blue eyes fixed on Matthew as if trying to read his heart. She had built a life around solitude, small routines, and quiet kindness. But this man had rattled something deep inside her. She still wasn't sure if it was resentment, sympathy, or the painful mirror of her own regrets. Beside her, Emma moved between the warming stations and the examination tables, her petite figure bustling with controlled energy. Her wavy auburn hair was pulled back into a loose braid, a few stray curls brushing her freckled cheeks. She was quick with her hands, but gentle with her voice, her soft green eyes flicking between the dogs, the monitors, and the two adults she was quietly observing. Emma had always been good at reading people. At 28, she carried both youthful optimism and the weary knowledge that people were often more complicated than they seemed. She watched as Matthew's tense shoulders relaxed slightly after the phone call, as Olivia's tightly set mouth softened at the edges, and she realized something delicate was unfolding between them, something less about confrontation and more about healing. "Matthew," Olivia said at last, her voice soft but steady, "why are you really doing this?" Matthew turned, slipping the phone into his coat pocket. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "I thought throwing Luna away would help me throw away the grief. I thought if I buried every piece of Rebecca's life, I'd stop feeling like I was drowning. But I was wrong." His voice roughened slightly, and he glanced toward Luna, who lay curled beside her puppies, her head resting on one outstretched paw. She stirred faintly at his gaze, her tail giving a soft, tired wag. "I can't undo what I did," Matthew continued, his gray eyes flicking back to Olivia, "but I can stop running from it." Emma smiled faintly to herself, her hands busy adjusting a monitor, but her heart quietly swelling with a sense of hope. She had seen many kinds of people in this job, those who gave up, those who walked away, and those rare few who came back, humbled, ready to make amends. Matthew, for all his polished exterior and sharp business edges, seemed to be the latter. Later that evening, the clinic's doors swung open, and a team of 2 additional veterinarians arrived, both of them bundled in thick parkas and carrying sleek professional medical bags. Dr. Hannah Larson was a tall, broad-shouldered woman in her early 40s, her skin a warm olive tone, and her black hair cropped close to her head. Known for her blunt honesty and fierce competence, Hannah carried herself with the no-nonsense air of someone who had long ago stopped tolerating inefficiency. Beside her was Dr. Alex Kim, a wiry man in his mid-30s with sharp, intelligent eyes, his black hair neatly combed, and his long fingers already busy flipping through patient notes. Matthew introduced them quickly, his deep voice carrying a mix of urgency and gratitude. Olivia, still wary but watching with growing curiosity, helped Emma prepare the space for their arrival. As they worked, Olivia noticed something new in Matthew, a quiet humility, a willingness to listen, to follow rather than command. "I've set up a donation," Matthew told Emma quietly between tasks, "for the local shelters. Enough to cover supplies, food, medicine for the next year. And I want to start funding an outreach program, something that finds cases like Luna's before they end up like this." Emma's eyes widened, then softened. "That's more than most people would do." Matthew gave a small, almost self-conscious shrug. "I'm not most people anymore." In the corner, Olivia caught the exchange, her pale eyes thoughtful. She still felt the sting of his past choices, but slowly, she was beginning to sense the weight he carried, the cracks he no longer tried to hide. Maybe, she thought, forgiveness wasn't always about erasing the past. Maybe it was about recognizing someone's attempt to step into the future, imperfect but genuine. Meanwhile, back at the cafe, the small drama of Whiskers and the puppies continued. The orange tabby had grudgingly accepted their presence, though he still perched on high shelves, watching the clumsy little invaders with narrow eyes. One especially adventurous puppy, a slightly chubby female with a white-tipped tail and floppy ears, had discovered Whiskers' favorite sunlit windowsill and now sat there proudly, tiny paws planted wide, tail wagging enthusiastically. Whiskers approached cautiously, his striped tail low, his nose twitching. He gave a soft, warning hiss. But when the puppy yawned sleepily and flopped onto her side, Whiskers let out a long sigh, leaped lightly onto the sill, and stretched himself beside her, his eyes half closed. Margaret, the neighbor who often visited, peeked in through the cafe window, smiling softly at the sight, her tall, stooped figure wrapped in her usual knitted shawl. At the clinic, as the night deepened, the room quieted, the chaos settling into a rhythm of quiet care. Matthew stood near the door, his tall frame silhouetted by the soft glow of the overhead lights, watching as Emma and the team tended to Luna and her puppies. Olivia joined him silently, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. After a long pause, she murmured, "You're not who I expected." Matthew gave a small, wry smile, the lines around his mouth softening. Neither am I. For the first time, Olivia allowed herself to let out a quiet breath. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the first small step toward it. Spring crept slowly into Anchorage, melting the thick snowbanks and replacing the bitter wind with a gentler breeze. Outside the clinic, the world seemed to soften. Patches of grass peeked through the slush. Birds returned to the trees, and people on the sidewalks walked with lighter steps. Inside, though, it was the warmth of a different kind that filled the rooms, a warmth made of laughter, quiet conversation, and the sounds of tiny, playful barks. The puppies had healed. Days of specialized care, expert treatment, and tireless love had brought them back from the edge, and now they tumbled across the clinic floor in a blur of cream-colored fur and wagging tails. Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor, her thin frame relaxed, a rare, genuine smile on her face as one puppy climbed into her lap. Her pale blue eyes sparkled with something she hadn't felt in years: joy. Across from her, Matthew crouched on one knee, his tall, broad-shouldered figure slightly hunched as he let a particularly bold puppy chew playfully on his shoelaces. His sharp features had softened over the past weeks. The deep grooves of tension around his mouth had eased, and his gray eyes, once guarded, now shone with quiet gratitude. He had traded tailored suits for simple sweaters, dark jeans, and scuffed boots, a man visibly learning to shed old layers. Emma moved between them with her usual bustling grace. The petite veterinarian, auburn hair tied back in a loose braid, her freckled cheeks flushed from hours on her feet, knelt beside the puppies, checking each one carefully. Her small, practiced hands moved quickly, her green eyes bright as she spoke. "They're all strong enough now," she said softly, smiling at both Olivia and Matthew. "It's time to start finding them their families." The first match came easily. Max, the smallest of the litter, his cream-colored fur still a little thinner, his movements more cautious, was paired with a young girl named Lily. Lily was 8, with sandy blonde hair and pigtails and bright blue eyes, but her left leg was braced in a wheelchair after a car accident the year before. She and her mother, Sarah, arrived at the clinic together. Sarah was in her late 30s, tall and slender, with shoulder-length auburn hair and kind, steady hazel eyes. There was a gentleness in how she bent beside her daughter, how she let Lily take the lead, holding Max carefully in her small hands. As Max nuzzled into Lily's lap, the girl's laughter filled the room, a pure, ringing sound that made Olivia's eyes mist over and made Matthew quietly clear his throat. Emma crouched beside them, explaining Max's care, watching the spark of connection unfold. "He'll help her," Emma murmured to Olivia as they watched, "and she'll help him." Next came Bella, the most even-tempered puppy of the bunch, her calm, thoughtful eyes always watching, her small body steady among her more excitable siblings. Bella was destined for the local nursing home, where she would be trained as a therapy dog, offering companionship to elderly residents. Olivia and Matthew accompanied Emma when she brought Bella to meet her new home, a place full of soft chairs, flowered curtains, and older faces that brightened with delight at the sight of the puppy. One elderly woman, Ruth, stood out among the crowd. Ruth was in her 80s, petite and slightly hunched, with snowy white hair in a neat bun, sharp blue eyes, and a quick, dry wit that made everyone around her laugh. She held Bella in her lap, her frail hands stroking the puppy's soft fur, her lined face breaking into a smile so wide it seemed to erase decades. "Well," Ruth said, her voice crackling with humor, "I guess I'm not the only old lady around here anymore." Then there was Rocky, the most rambunctious, mischievous puppy, forever getting underfoot, chewing shoelaces, and tumbling over his siblings in gleeful chaos. He went to the Thomas family, local farmers who lived just outside Anchorage. The Thomases were a boisterous crew. Ben, a broad-chested, bearded man in his 40s with calloused hands and a laugh that shook the room. His wife, Kelly, shorter and sturdier, with curly brown hair and a practical, no-nonsense air, and their 3 children, all under 12, who piled eagerly around Rocky, their delighted shrieks echoing through the clinic. "He's going to fit right in," Olivia whispered to Emma, watching Rocky barrel straight into the arms of one of the boys, tail wagging wildly. Amidst all the rehoming, one puppy remained. Milo, a quiet, thoughtful little male with soulful eyes, and a curious tilt to his head, had attached himself firmly to Emma. Wherever she went, Milo followed, watching her from under examination tables, curling at her feet during long nights, pressing his small body against her side during breaks. Emma, who had always prided herself on keeping work and personal life separate, found herself unable to resist his quiet devotion. One evening, as Olivia and Matthew prepared the last adoption papers, Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, Milo cradled in her lap. She glanced up, a shy, almost embarrassed smile on her face. I think he's staying with me." Matthew raised an eyebrow, a rare grin tugging at his mouth. "Looks like you've been claimed?" Olivia laughed softly, the sound warm and gentle. "Good for you, Emma." As the last puppy found his home, Luna remained by Olivia's side. The older dog, now fully recovered, followed Olivia from room to room, her eyes soft, her gait steady, her presence a constant comfort. Olivia, who had spent so many years alone, decided to transform her quiet cafe into something new. A cafe where dogs and cats were welcome, where locals could bring their pets, share stories, and maybe even find a new companion. She called it the Paws and Whiskers Cafe, a tribute to the orange tabby who still ruled the roost with a firm but tolerant paw. Inside the cafe, laughter echoed, paws tapped across the floor, and the scent of coffee mingled with the occasional yip or purr. Olivia, standing behind the counter with Luna at her feet, glanced out over her little kingdom, one she had never expected, one she had almost missed, but one that had brought her back to life. Spring had stretched its green fingers fully across Anchorage now, melting the last icy patches on the sidewalks and filling the air with bird song. At the corner of Maple and 3rd, the Paws and Whiskers Cafe buzzed with the soft sounds of conversation, laughter, and the occasional happy bark or sharp meow. Olivia, standing behind the counter in a soft cream-colored sweater and dark jeans, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a loose bun, moved with graceful familiarity. She poured coffee, sliced pastries, and occasionally bent to scratch Luna, who now lay contentedly at her feet. Olivia's cafe had become something unexpected, a local treasure. It wasn't just the coffee or the pastries, though those were beloved. It was the atmosphere. People came to sip their drinks with their dogs at their feet or their cats perched on tables. The story of Olivia and Luna, the once abandoned dog and the woman who took her in, had quietly spread, first through word of mouth, then through social media posts shared by curious customers. Now, photos of Olivia's cafe filled local feeds. Luna sitting proudly beside the counter, whiskers stretched lazily across the window ledge, and cheerful groups of pets and owners filling the tables. It had all started, Olivia knew, with Matthew. Matthew Hartley entered the cafe just as he always did now. Not in sleek suits or polished shoes, but in a simple navy jacket over a button-down, dark jeans, and scuffed boots. His storm gray eyes, once sharp and distant, now crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His dark hair, still neatly trimmed, but touched by soft gray at the temples, gave him a distinguished but approachable air. He had traded business boardrooms for something entirely different, the messy, unpredictable world of redemption. Today, he carried a small leather folder, its edges worn from frequent handling. He approached the counter, where Olivia raised a brow, smiling faintly. "Coffee, Matthew?" she asked. He chuckled, his voice lower and warmer than it had once been. "You know me too well." As Olivia prepared his order, Matthew glanced around the cafe, nodding to familiar faces. Sarah, the mother of little Lily, the girl who had adopted Max, sat by the window, her slender figure dressed in a light green blouse, her auburn hair pulled back neatly. Lily, cheerful as ever, was laughing as Max climbed into her lap, his tail wagging so hard it thumped the table leg. Near them sat Ruth, the sharp-tongued but warm-hearted elder from the nursing home, sipping tea with a friend while Bella, the therapy dog, lay quietly at her feet, her calm gaze surveying the room. Matthew had grown into someone different over these months. His journey hadn't been sudden or easy, but it had been real. After seeing the puppies placed into loving homes, after spending time at the clinic with Emma and Olivia, he had asked himself what more he could do, not just for them, but for every Luna still waiting, still struggling. The answer had come in the form of the Rebecca Hartley Animal Welfare Fund, a charity dedicated to rescuing, rehabilitating, and rehoming abandoned animals throughout Alaska. Matthew had poured not only his money, but his time into it, surprising even himself. He no longer shied away from the pain of remembering Rebecca. Instead, he honored her by building something she would have loved. As Olivia handed him his coffee, Matthew offered the leather folder. "These are the final papers for the latest grant," he said softly. "We're funding a new shelter on the north side. They'll need volunteers, too." Olivia took the folder carefully, her pale blue eyes softening. "You've come a long way, Matthew," she murmured. He smiled, a little wry, a little self-deprecating. "I've had good teachers." In the background, Emma arrived, her petite figure bustling in with Milo, the thoughtful puppy she had kept, trotting happily at her heels. Her wavy auburn hair was half tied up, her freckled face lit with a smile as she greeted Olivia and Matthew. "Big meeting this afternoon," she said cheerfully. "They're asking if you'll come, Matthew." He nodded, sipping his coffee thoughtfully. "Of course, I'll be there." Meanwhile, the cafe hummed with life. Customers snapped photos of their dogs sprawled on sunny benches or of Luna greeting guests near the counter. Posts about Olivia's story, Matthew's charity, and the quirky little cafe filled local Instagram and Facebook pages, drawing attention far beyond Anchorage. A few local news outlets had even called, curious about the transformation of a once lonely cafe into a hub of community and care. Olivia, who had once preferred the quiet, found herself smiling as she wiped down tables, watching her world grow in ways she had never imagined. She still enjoyed her solitary mornings, her coffee brewed just right, the soft hum of the radio in the background. But she had also learned to love the messy, noisy, joy-filled life that had come to fill her cafe. Near the window, Whiskers stretched luxuriously, his orange fur glowing in the sunlight. One of the younger cafe patrons, a teenage girl with long dark hair and a shy smile, leaned in to snap a picture, cooing softly at him. Whiskers opened one eye, gave her a long, measuring look, then flicked his tail with regal indifference. Matthew stood by the door now, ready to leave, but he paused, watching Olivia as she laughed at something Emma had said. Luna pressed happily against her side. He had come here first out of guilt, then out of duty, but now he stayed because he belonged. "I'll see you both soon," Matthew said quietly, nodding to Olivia and Emma. Olivia reached over to touch his arm briefly, her fingers warm. "Thank you, Matthew," she said softly, "for everything." He smiled, a real, unguarded smile, and stepped outside, the sunlight catching in his graying hair. Inside, the cafe buzzed on, its little universe alive with forgiveness, laughter, and the promise of second chances. The spring afternoon bathed Anchorage in a soft golden light, the sun filtering gently through the freshly budded trees around the Paws and Whiskers cafe. The garden out back, once a modest patch of dirt and patchy grass, had been transformed into a small oasis. Wooden benches lined the flower beds, strings of fairy lights danced between the branches, and the sweet scent of blooming daisies mixed with the aroma of fresh coffee drifting from the cafe's open door. Olivia stood near the back steps, her slim figure wrapped in a light cream cardigan, a delicate silver necklace catching the sunlight at her throat. Her once stern face now carried the softness of laughter lines and warm smiles, and her pale blue eyes sparkled as she watched Luna tumble gently in the grass with Milo. Luna's golden fur, once ragged and dull, now glowed healthily under the sun, her body strong again, her tail wagging in steady happiness. Whiskers, the old orange tabby, perched on a windowsill nearby, his tail flicking lazily as he observed the scene with the detached wisdom of a king watching his kingdom thrive. His once wary eyes had softened toward the puppies who occasionally pawed at him, and though he still maintained his lofty position, everyone knew he secretly enjoyed the company. Emma was laughing nearby, kneeling on the grass in her rolled-up jeans and a pale green blouse, her auburn braid trailing over one shoulder. She tossed a small ball toward Milo, who bounded after it with enthusiastic little hops. Her freckled face was flushed from the sun, her soft green eyes brighter than usual. Sitting next to her was a newcomer, Daniel. Daniel was tall, around 30, with a lean, athletic build and tousled dark blonde hair. His tan skin bore the faint lines of someone who'd spent years outdoors, his sharp jawline softened by a relaxed smile. His hazel eyes sparkled with easy humor as he watched Emma play with the dogs, and when she turned to grin at him, there was something unspoken in the glance they exchanged, something Emma had once thought she'd lost. Daniel had been her college sweetheart, the one who had slipped away when career paths diverged and long distances proved too much. But recently, he had returned to Anchorage, his job in wildlife conservation, bringing him back to the place where they had once dreamed together. Over the past few weeks, Emma had found herself rediscovering a familiar rhythm with him, their conversations flowing effortlessly, their smiles tinged with a quiet hope. Olivia glanced over at Matthew, who sat comfortably on one of the benches, his long legs stretched out, his dark jeans slightly dusty from earlier helping in the garden. His storm-gray eyes, once shadowed by grief, now gleamed with a quiet warmth as he watched the group around him. His dark hair, touched with silver at the temples, gave him a distinguished air, and the soft smile tugging at his mouth spoke of someone who had learned to live again. "Not a bad turnout," Matthew murmured, lifting his coffee cup slightly toward Olivia in a small toast. Olivia chuckled softly, tucking a strand of silver hair behind her ear. "Not bad at all," she agreed. Around them, the garden buzzed with quiet life. Sarah and Lily sat near the flower beds, Lily's wheelchair parked beside her mother's bench. The young girl's laughter rang out as Max, her loyal puppy, wagged and pranced around her, occasionally resting his small paws on her lap to nuzzle her face. Ruth, the feisty elder from the nursing home, occupied another bench. Bella, the therapy dog, lying patiently at her feet, occasionally nudging Ruth's hand for a scratch. Nearby, the Thomases, the boisterous farming family, were visiting with Rocky, the most mischievous of the litter, who now tried to chew on a garden glove Ben Thomas held teasingly out of reach. The air was filled with warmth, not just from the sun, but from the shared connection of lives intertwined, stories healed, wounds mended. Olivia took a long breath, savoring it all. Matthew rose from the bench and approached her, his tall frame casting a comfortable shadow at her side. "You've built something special here," he said softly, his voice carrying genuine admiration. Olivia smiled up at him, the lines around her eyes deepening. "We built it, Matthew. You, me, Emma, Luna, Whiskers, all of us." For a long moment, they stood in companionable silence, watching the others laugh, talk, and play. Then, Olivia's sharp eyes caught the way Emma glanced shyly at Daniel, how he reached to brush a stray curl from her face, their smiles lingering a little too long. Olivia gave a soft, knowing chuckle. Matthew followed her gaze and let out a small, surprised laugh. "Well," he murmured, "that's interesting." Olivia nudged him lightly with her elbow. "Young love always finds a way." Matthew shook his head, smiling. "Let's just hope Milo approves." The sun began to dip lower, casting the garden in a golden glow. Laughter continued to rise, soft voices blending with the sounds of wagging tails and the occasional bark. Whiskers stretched luxuriously, hopping down from his perch to weave lazily between the benches, accepting the occasional scratch from passers-by. As the evening settled in, the little cafe garden became something more than just a gathering place. It became a symbol of second chances, of forgiveness, of lives once fractured finding their way back to wholeness. A new family, not tied by blood, but by choice, by kindness, by the shared promise to care for each other. Under the twinkling fairy lights, Olivia, Matthew, Emma, Daniel, Luna, Whiskers, and the scattered circle of humans and animals settled into a gentle, glowing peace. And somewhere in the air, there hung the quiet possibility of a wedding in the future, of vows not yet spoken, of happiness still waiting to unfold. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come in flashes of lightning or grand, dramatic moments. Sometimes, they arrive softly, wrapped in golden fur, wagging tails, quiet forgiveness, and the small, steady acts of love that transform not just one life, but many. In Luna's journey, in Olivia's patience, in Matthew's redemption, and in Emma's open heart, we are reminded that God works in the spaces between our pain and our healing. He places opportunities for grace into our hands, asking only that we reach out, that we care, that we choose love again, even when we've been hurt. This story isn't just about a dog, or a cafe, or a handful of people trying to mend their pasts. It's about the everyday miracles God weaves through our lives when we open ourselves to community, to kindness, and to second chances. If this touched your heart, tell us where you're watching from. Share this story, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue spreading stories of hope and healing. And tonight, as you rest, may God bless you and your loved ones. May He guide you to recognize the small miracles waiting in your own life. May He remind you, no matter how broken things feel, grace is always near.